Hey everybody, how are you? I wanted to talk about a subject that's kind of interested me for some time, and I've always had thoughts about it, and I haven't said too much about it over the years. But it's a question I've been asked a bunch of times. You might know that I've been a college professor for 35 years, pushing 30. I taught my first college class back in the 80s, and I've been a professor, of rank since the early 90s. And so I feel like I have some comments to make. They're just kind of my personal thoughts. So you'll have to forgive if I digress a little bit. And if you're not interested in this subject, that's fine. But I wanted to talk about it. Maybe some of you are. And that subject is, what can you do with a degree in history besides teach? I've been asked that question numerous times in the last 35 years. What can you do with the degree in history besides teach? I've been asked that question a number of times by parents, and I've also heard it mentioned either directly or indirectly a ton of times by other people. Orientation sessions, departmental literature, whatever. Some version of that question: what can you do with the degree in history besides teach? Now, let me make a little disclaimer before I continue on. I might say some things you agree with or some things you don't agree with, and that's fine. And I'm certainly not trying to rub anybody the wrong way. I'm just going to give you my candid views on that question. What can you do with a degree in history besides teach? I'm going to tell you what I think about it. And one thing, before I get started, I would like to say, when you're asked that question and you're sitting there as someone who's very dedicated to teaching, I feel like I'm pretty dedicated to teaching. And then you have a parent come in and say, gee, what can someone do? What can my son do with, or daughter do with the degree in history besides teach? It's hard not to feel a little insulted by that. What the hell is wrong with teaching? And I think sometimes they see being a college professor as something other than being a teacher, and maybe that's a point I'm going to make a little later. But maybe that's one of the things that bothers me. But even if you don't want to teach at the college level, certainly one of the number one things you can do with the degree in history is teach. Teach at the junior high level, teach at the high school level. Those are good middle class jobs. It's too bad that our public schools have become so totally effed up. Um, uh, and I'm a big supporter of public schools as they used to be, not so much as they've become. But anyway, there's nothing wrong with teaching at the high school or college level. And I think when parents ask that, a lot of times they're thinking of a certain kind of job. They're thinking of like a doctor or a lawyer or a certain kind of job like that that has a lot of status and makes a lot of money. And that sort of exposes the fact in a very naked way that that's their reason for going to college. Now that's not the kind of thing a lot of people say in polite company. I'm just going to college to make a lot of money and to get a lot of status. Although it's obviously something that drives higher education now, particularly a lot of expensive elite schools. And I've been fortunate. I teach at a school that's quite elite. I find it somewhat ironic that the more we've tried to be elite and the more we've emphasized excellence, we've pretty consistently slipped in the ratings, but we're still ranked quite high compared to most schools in the country. But we were actually a lot higher when I got there, and I heard a lot more about teaching and a lot less about U.S. News World Report, marketing. The big emphasis on marketing, I would say, came maybe in the early 2000s, and I find it interesting that the more we've emphasized kind of marketing and the sizzle more than the steak, as it were, we've actually slipped in the rankings. By the way, I'm not commenting on my school per se. That's just an observation I had. I'm certainly very privileged to teach where I do and so on. And my point is not to comment on my personal situation or anything like that. I'm just telling you my thoughts after having taught for 35 years and what I have seen, sometimes kind of silently seen. But when a parent asks you that, what can my son or daughter do with a degree in history besides teach? On the one hand, it's not a wrong question. There's nothing wrong with the parent asking that question, particularly when they're being asked to cough up $80,000, or heck, it's probably going to be 90,000 next year. I keep reading. It's kind of almost funny. I keep reading how our current administration has kept inflation so down, and then you read about these tuition increases where it costs some American family $90,000 to go to college, and then you have people tell you, "Oh, there's no inflation." I mean, the expense of college education is way higher than the rate of inflation, as are medical costs. There are other things like that too. Medical costs and college tuition are two areas that come to mind. I guess they don't count those when they consider inflation. So the next time someone tells you that there's no inflation, and then turns around and pays tens of thousands of dollars for a single semester of college, just remind yourself that there's no inflation. But I don't think there's anything wrong with the parent asking, "Hey, my young adult, my offspring is, we're paying a lot of money to be here. If he or she goes into history, what are the options?" So that's certainly not an inappropriate question at all. And I've never been much for the just sort of take all these courses, explore yourself, find yourself, because it's good to have a purpose and a goal. I happen to think liberal arts and history and a good overall liberal arts education are extremely compatible with our goals. Although I'm not sure about the way things have been configured recently in terms of liberal arts education, but certainly a traditional liberal arts education is compatible with any goal. So when you hear that, what can I do with a degree in history besides teach? It's a little bit perplexing, because I guess they're saying my child doesn't want to be a teacher, and of course that is one of the main things you would do with history. You don't have to. By the way, if you get a major in history or a minor in history, obviously traditionally it's one of the best areas of preparation for law school, particularly if you have a good history degree where you learn like geography, international politics, major acts of public legislation, major moments in international history, major battles, the leaders of the past and how they have confronted the challenges of their time. That is good, solid history. History, which, at least in an overview sense, has traditionally been offered at the introductory level. So there's nothing at all wrong with asking that question, but the answer can't be, well, don't even think about teaching at all. History is an excellent subject for pre-law. It's a great. By the way, history is also a good subject to study for medical school, provided you have, the courses that a medical school is going to want to see. If you like history, go ahead and major in it, or minor in it at least. But just be sure that you're taking, the courses a medical school will want to see. But there's certainly nothing wrong with history. I would recommend taking solid history courses, like I said, that have geography and things. But, it's kind of funny that the courses that are designed to teach are courses like 101, 102. If you think about it, when I came into history, there were more jobs. I mean, people back then used to talk about the job shortage, but man, it's nothing like now. Compared to today, history and English Lit, I'll include them, departments were extremely strong compared to how they are now. And part of that was because they had a strong commitment to teaching, like 101 or 102 type courses, which, aside from the philosophical commitment to teaching, just as a practical matter, also meant that, there were a lot of students in those courses. They were general education courses. They weren't designed for, they weren't they were kind of designed to give people an overview, but I kind of find it funny that you know, but History 101 and 102 are courses that if you want to go into history and teach, you definitely need to know the material in those courses. So when we drop 101 and 102, which we've done at school after school after school, when you drop 101 and 102, you're basically kind of punting on the commitment to teaching. And if you think about it, a lot of schools now, I wouldn't say they emphasize teaching that much. Certainly the elite schools don't. I think most elite schools, you can barely go there to be a teacher. Like if you want to be a teacher, you should go to some kind of a state school or something. And there's nothing wrong with that, by the way. But if you know a lot of like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, Berkeley, I don't even think they really make that much of an option, if an option at all, that one of their graduates could prepare for teaching high school, which is a real shame if you think about it, because we need well prepared students in history to keep history going, and not, just as a practical matter, but also as a philosophical matter. History's become like a Ponzi scheme. I mean, you started out, it's kind of like a Ponzi bubble. You started out with all these really solid, viable departments of the 80s, and I would say up through the 90s, particularly anyway, the mid 90s. And then we started dropping all these requirements, adding all these electives, hiring all these different kinds of disciplines, all which attach themselves onto history. I always enjoyed women's history. I had an excellent women's history class when I was an undergrad, and I really enjoyed it. It was a 300 level class with a 101 or whatever the numbering was. I'm using 101 as a kind of metaphor for introductory courses, but it did require either the permission of the instructor or having taken 101. This was in U.S. history, so I don't remember the number, but you had to take that 101. And I would say that was a more rigorous women's history because it was kind of grounded in an overall context of U.S. history. And the same thing with European history. So when I started, that women's history was kind of new, and so people had different opinions about it, but I certainly always enjoyed it. But it was usually taught as a 300 level class. Now, in the past 20 years, we've added women's studies, and that's just become sort of overnight a whole discipline unto itself. Uh, but you don't have, I think, always that grounding in an overall perspective of of uh, of U.S. history or European history or world history or whatever part of the world you happen to be studying. And I think that's too bad. And I also think it has a lot of sort of practical ramifications in terms of the curriculum. But when you say what can you do with a degree in history besides teach, uh, it's always kind of bothered me again because the other thing is I think it sort of shows, like I said, it's not a wrong question to ask. I think that's kind of a thoughtless way to phrase it, but it's not a wrong question to ask. But that question and the way that's phrased, and some of the times I've been asked that, I just get a sense that there's no real underlying talent or authenticity that is driving the student or the parents. They just want a certain kind of job, a certain kind of college degree, and we shouldn't cater to those kinds of students. Harvard and Yale and Princeton are, they're the most selective schools in the country. They've had their share of issues, but let's use them as a standard, that they're the most selective. Everybody that applies to those schools has great test scores, great transcripts, probably great letters, great, carefully manicured extracurricular activities. But I think the people they look for, beyond that, everybody's like that at those schools. So the people they look for are people who have talent and authenticity. I don't think they want a bunch of people who just say, I want to be a doctor I'm not sure what kind. Maybe it'll be optometry. Maybe it'll be dentistry. Maybe I'll be a pediatrician. There's something, I just want some kind of doctor, some kind of lawyer. I don't care. Just, whatever. They don't want those kind of people. And it kind of filters on down. So sometimes the schools kind of just under like Harvard, Yale, Princeton on the feeding chain, they kind of inherit this big blast of students who are a lot of them are smart, but they don't really have any particular talent or authenticity, and they're definitely not interested in teaching. They're interested in that certain kind of job, but they don't really have a particular. That question to me, what can I do with the degree in history besides teach, implies that they're not really particularly interested in history, and they don't particularly have anything they're good at or want to do. They're just kind of fishing around, and I think the really top schools sort of try to filter out those people. So, although school's so expensive now, you end up admitting schools as students based on financial reasons if they're good enough students and they can pay. But I think ideally, you want students that are excellent and can do the work, and but you also want students that have talent and authenticity. When a parent asks me, well, what can my son or daughter do with a degree in history besides teach? If I were feeling snarky, which I'm not, and I would never say this, obviously, but sometimes you feel like saying, I don't know, lady, can your kid throw a 98 mile an hour fastball? Maybe you can pitch for the Braves. Can your kid shred on the guitar? I hear Van Halen's looking for a new guitarist. Eddie just died. Can your kid paint great paint? I mean, it just sort of implies that they don't really have any talent. And I actually see so many kids that do have talent, and they kind of suppress their talents so that they can take all these things to get a college degree. I'll pass all these requirements. And you know what? College should be a place where you are encouraged to develop your talents. Even, if you're a great piano player, college should be a place where you hone those skills, even if you don't end up being a pianist. And I certainly think that's true of history. I know a lot of the best history students I've ever had were people out of the sciences and pre-med. That's been my personal experience. Some of the worst history students I've ever had have been that kind of, what can you do with a degree in history besides teach? They just sit there, they just ask all the time, is this going to be on the test? And all those stereotypes of apathetic, disengaged students. And it's really too bad. And of course, I would never say that to a parent. What can you do with a degree in history besides teach? Well, I don't know, lady, can your kid throw a 98 mile an hour fastball? Maybe the Braves will pick him up as, one of their starters. I would never say that, but I think the question does kind of lead you down that road where what is the talent? What is the purpose of this student? Do they have anything they want to do? Is it just like a job? Is it just, any job, like I said, optometrist, dentist, pediatrician, whatever, just some kind of job with a professional credential and a good salary and a lot of status so I can live in the right zip code. And I think that is a very corrupting thing, actually. But let's see here. Yeah, I think, the kind of related to that, I think schools not only don't emphasize teaching, but they flat out, sometimes they see it as a negative. Like they don't want to put down, well, you can be a teacher if you major in history in our history program. They don't even want to put that down because I think it'll turn students off. Now think about that. It's going to turn students off to tell them, history is a great subject to be a teacher. Another great profession for a history major is the ministry. And of course, most of our colleges, private ones, came out of the church. A lot of people can't even fathom that. But some of them still have at least some shred of a church affiliation. And we should also, as part of that, be making it possible for people to train for the ministry. And I think history is a great subject to train for the ministry, and there's nothing wrong with that either. And I think religion and teaching kind of go together. You know, Christ gave us the Great Commission to go into all the world and preach the gospel unto every creature. And teaching, you know, the word teaching, I think in Matthew 28:20, that's one version of the Great Commission. I used to read a lot of the Bible, and I always said Matthew 28:20 was my favorite Bible verse, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. And lo, I am with thee always, even unto the end of the age. But his last words on earth, Christ taught us to be teachers. And whether you end up being a high school teacher or not, if you go into history, I would hope that you have a kind of outreach approach. History is not just something you take so you can be an optometrist or some kind of a lawyer. It's outreach. Well, the reason we study history is to enrich our own perspectives and those of others, to have something to offer to the world that understanding history gives us. So it doesn't have to be, but that question, what can I do with a degree in history besides teach, is to me very can be a kind of an offensive question. The final thing I wanted to say is I think the Modern Research University might be a little bit of a Ponzi scam. Like I said, you know, at the beginning of a Ponzi bubble, you know, everybody makes money and you've got this kind of solid base, and then you have to keep adding to it and adding to it. And pretty soon the whole thing collapses. I think the math of a Ponzi bubble can get kind of complicated, but the gist of it is the first people in make out like bandits, and then everybody else that comes in later kind of respond, oh, it looks like they're doing pretty well, maybe I'll go over there. And you have this kind of mass, it's also kind of like urban sprawl. You have this mass kind of emigration into these disciplines, and the more people that come in that are just coming in there for those kind of opportunistic reasons, or because they don't have anything else really in particular they want to do or be, then sooner or later the discipline caves. And I think that's especially true if you don't have a commitment to 101 and 102. Again, I'm using 101 and 102 as a kind of a metaphor for any kind of freshman level introductory course. You're not really preparing people to be teachers, I would say, of a coherent discipline. You know, like math. If you want to be a math teacher, you need to know, you know, there are coherent sequential courses you need to know what you're going to teach. And if you just have kind of nothing, well, we're just gonna, you know, I teach this kind of special topic, and over here in this office, my colleague teaches this kind of special topic. In a way, you've sort of punted on the traditional idea of teaching history, which is it's transmitting a heritage. I think a lot of people would not agree with that today. But to me, history is transmitting a heritage. This is America. We study U.S. history to enrich our appreciation and understanding of America and to make us better Americans. This is sort of a Western culture. We hear that all the time. Some people don't like that term, but we're a Western culture. We study Western Civ and European history to make us, to enrich our perspectives, and also because so many of our overarching institutions, attitudes, belief systems come from the West. Now, that can change and expand over time, but when you just kind of get rid of it altogether overnight, you don't really have anything left. It's like when they tear down all these monuments, you notice they're always good at tearing things down. They're not so good at building new things. So I imagine if you went around the country today, all those monuments that were torn down in 2020, I bet most of them are empty pedestals or just cleared out uh, plazas. They aren't going to replace those. And by the way, a lot of those statues are quite historic. It's hard to imagine them replacing them with a lot of those statues of generals they smashed and took down. were some of the finest statuary in the country. You never heard that. It was just all about how offensive they were. But you notice they haven't replaced them. Not many that I'm aware of. I'll stand corrected, but they're just empty. And I think that's kind of what happened to history. The way it was taught when I came in, it was kind of torn down, but they didn't really replace it with anything. Just all these special topics courses, and they're not producing new students that can kind of come in and teach history. So you have all these graduate students, and you know what they say is, what can I do with the degree in history besides teach? I know, I'll go be a college professor. Now think about that. I'm telling you, that is the prevailing mindset in a lot of academia today. What can I do with the degree in English lit besides teach? I know, I'll go be a college professor. What can I do with the degree in philosophy besides teach? I know, I'll go be a college professor. And being a professor is teaching. But when you're not bringing new students in, um, that's kind of that when that Ponzi bubble starts to burst, when the new investors kind of dry up. I personally think that's one reason we've had so much immigration presence in our elite schools, but even just schools, a lot of schools in America, certainly our elite schools, they don't just like those students. Those students don't just help enrich our perspectives or something, which you sometimes hear. Those students are essential because they pay all that tuition, and a lot of you'll even see it when in editorials and things. A lot of schools would not be able to survive without all these international students. By the way, I've had some wonderful international students, and I think it's great that they come over here. But I don't think it's great that our own society, America, apparently is unable to produce enough students to fill the ranks of our own schools, which, by the way, have they've been losing enrollment and losing American students while simultaneously expanding programs, expanding disciplines. There's so many disciplines and ologies and istes and things now that were smaller or even non-existent 30 years ago, and they've expanded all this. And I think to an extent, the schools have been funded in a lot of their expansion by particularly Chinese students. And if those Chinese students ever kind of decide, well, this isn't really for me, which definitely is possible. I see a lot of international students that aren't happy campers. Some of them love it here, but a lot of them aren't. If a lot of them ever, if a lot of them ever decide, hey, this place isn't for me, then you're going to see a disaster. And we haven't really produced our own homegrown students enough, and I think that's really a shame. And I will always stick up for preparing young people to be teachers. My goodness gracious. And you don't have to be a teacher if you major in history. Just like if you're a Christian and you major in the Bible, that doesn't mean you have to go live in Africa and be a missionary. But that should never be anything we discourage. And we should also build programs that enable people to serve in ministry, and teaching is a type of calling, I would argue. We should always have programs that enable that. And I'm not sure we do now. And I think some of the fights we have over history on what's being taught, in Florida, they're having these big arguments. Um, and I know everybody hates Ron DeSantis, but I actually agree with some things about education where we need to get back with, teaching like coherent disciplines. The problem is no one agrees with like what should be taught in history. So you have like, or they agree about one group that's kind of agrees with doing it a certain way, and the other group doesn't. But I think it's pretty much a basic that we should have students that are exposed, if in history, that are exposed to the major, if it's U.S. history, the major events, issues, trends, acts of public legislation, international moments of international significance, major battles. A battle can decide the fate of generations for centuries to come in 3 hours of fighting, and the history's full of battles like that, and they're very significant. And I think those things should be emphasized to freshmen and sophomores. And when you get too far away from that, then you don't really have anything particular to teach. Everybody just kind of teaches what they like. And sooner or later, history and subjects like it, that's a lot of what's happened to the humanities, become kind of just special topics. And a lot of these STEM subjects are on steroids because they still have all these requirements, all these specific courses people have to take, sequential ordering. And you notice how strong they are. Well, that's how history was when I started teaching. And they had to get rid of like 101 and 102 type courses in order to make way for what you see in history now, which is all these electives. But I do think it's kind of like a Ponzi bubble, and at some point they're going to run out of people that want to take a lot of these special topics classes, or unless I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I definitely think that's a possibility. But the one thing is, what can you do with the degree in history besides teach? You should definitely never discourage teaching. When someone asks that question in a meeting with parents or in some kind of orientation or some kind of majors meeting, I find it, if anything offends me, it's the fact that they don't even bring up teaching. They'll say like, "Well, Hewlett Packard just loves to hire, ballet majors and whatever in their executive ranks, and that you should never rule out teaching, and you should never set up your program so that people who want to teach really aren't even able to do it. That's what a lot of these schools, you can't go there. You could be the best historians in the country, and they're not even set up to prepare people to teach, and it's a damn shame. So I do find that question with that particular tone kind of offensive, and I'm going to stop talking now because I think I've talked a while. Maybe you can play this in your car or whatever, and just listen to me share my thoughts, somewhat rambling. I did make some notes. But what can you do with a degree in history besides teach? Well, you can go to law or medical school. But if you're asking that question to me, I'm suspicious that you don't have any particular talent. You're not really driven by talent and authenticity. You're driven by materialism. By the way, there's nothing wrong with money, but you're driven by materialism, a sense of status without the underlying qualities that make for high status. Like I said, I find it interesting that as our schools have emphasized how excellent they are and hyped and marketing and sort of tried to create these images of these elite little hothouses of all these wonderful people, they've gone down. And I would never say that schools are better today that I'm aware of than they were 40 years ago. I know a lot of people would disagree with that because they were less diverse 30 or 40 years ago, but I'm just looking at it in terms of the content of what was taught, the more affordable tuition, relatively speaking, the fact that I think there was more of a sense of serving the country with and serving American students, and a lot of that goes to a commitment to teaching, and not just teaching at the college level, but teaching at secondary and junior high levels. So I'm going to get off my soapbox now, but I just kind of did want to share that. Thanks. God bless.